The autumn of 1997 was particularly brutal in the mountains of West Virginia. 3 weeks of unseasonable warmth had given way to an early frost that killed everything still clinging to life. I was working as a surveyor for the state forestry department then, mapping old logging roads that had been abandoned since the 1940s. It was solitary work, which suited me fine. After my divorce, I needed the silence of the mountains more than I needed human company. The assignment that would change everything came on a Thursday morning in late October. My supervisor, Dale Brennan, spread a yellowed topographical map across his desk and tapped a remote section with his coffee-stained finger. "Need you to survey Blackwater Hollow," he said without looking up. "State's thinking about putting in a new access road for the fire towers." I studied the map. Blackwater Hollow was a deep valley carved between two ridges, accessible only by a single dirt road that snaked down from the main highway. The nearest town was Beckley, 40 miles away. Even by Appalachian standards, it was isolated. "How long since anyone's been back there?" I asked. Dale shrugged. "Decade, maybe more. Used to be a small community in the hollow, maybe 15, 20 families. Coal played out in the 50s, and folks just left." He folded the map and handed it to me. "Shouldn't take more than a week. There's an old forestry cabin about halfway down. Keys in the usual place." I packed my truck that afternoon, surveying equipment, camping gear, a week's worth of canned food, and my grandfather S.3006 rifle. In those mountains, you never knew what you might encounter. Bears were common, and there had been reports of wild boar moving up from the south. The drive to Blackwater Hollow took most of Friday. The main highway gave way to progressively smaller roads until I found myself on a rutted dirt track that seemed to have been forgotten by time itself. Ancient oaks and maples pressed close on both sides, their branches forming a canopy so thick that even in late afternoon, I had to use my headlights. The forestry cabin sat in a small clearing about 6 miles down the hollow road. It was a simple log structure, maybe 30 feet square, with a stone chimney and a covered porch. Weeds had grown up around the foundation, and several shutters hung at odd angles, but it looked solid enough. I unloaded my gear and got the generator running. The cabin had no electricity or phone service, the nearest line was 20 miles away. But there was a well with a hand pump, and the fireplace drew properly. As evening fell, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and planned my work for the next day. That's when I first heard it. It started as a low humming, so faint I thought it might be the generator. But when I walked around to check, the sound seemed to be coming from deeper in the hollow. It rose and fell in a rhythm that was almost musical, not quite a song, but something with structure and purpose. I stood listening for perhaps 10 minutes before it faded away entirely. Probably just wind through the rock formations, I told myself. The hollow was full of caves and overhangs that could create strange acoustic effects. Saturday morning dawned clear and cold. I spent the day working my way down the hollow, taking measurements and marking GPS coordinates. The old road was in worse shape than I'd expected. Washouts had carved deep gullies across it in several places, and fallen trees blocked the path every few hundred yards. It would take significant work to make it passable for fire department vehicles. About 3 miles down from the cabin, I came across the first sign of the old community Dale had mentioned. A rusted mailbox leaned at a crazy angle next to what had once been a driveway. Following the overgrown path, I found the remains of a small house. The roof had collapsed decades ago, but the stone foundation and chimney still stood. Wild grapevines had grown up through the ruins, creating an eerie green shroud over the debris. I photographed the site and made notes. There would be historical significance to consider if the state wanted to build through here. As I worked, I had the distinct feeling I was being watched. Several times I turned around quickly, expecting to see someone behind me, but the forest remained empty. By late afternoon, I had surveyed about half the distance I needed to cover. The sun was setting early behind the western ridge, and the temperature was dropping fast. I packed up my equipment and hiked back to the cabin as shadows began to pool in the deepest parts of the hollow. I was frying some bacon for dinner when I heard the humming again. This time it was louder, more distinct. It seemed to be coming from multiple directions at once, as if several people were humming the same tune from different points around the cabin. I stepped onto the porch and listened carefully. The sound was definitely human, or at least, made by human vocal cords. But there was something wrong with the harmonies, something that made the hair on my arm stand up. The notes seemed to slide between pitches in ways that human voices shouldn't be able to manage. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" The humming stopped immediately, as if cut off by a switch. The silence that followed felt oppressive, unnatural. Even the normal night sounds of the forest, the rustle of small animals, the call of owls, had ceased. I went back inside and checked the locks on the door and windows. Not that locks would do much good in a wooden cabin, but the ritual of securing the space made me feel slightly better. I loaded the rifle and propped it against the wall next to my bed. Sleep came fitfully. I woke several times throughout the night, always with the sensation that I had heard something that shouldn't be there. But when I lay still and listened, there was only silence. Sunday morning brought a thick fog that filled the hollow like gray soup. I couldn't see more than 20 feet in any direction. Rather than risk getting lost in the maze of game trails and old logging roads, I decided to stay close to the cabin and work on organizing my notes from the previous day. The fog didn't lift until nearly noon. When it finally cleared, I discovered that someone had been in my camp. My surveying equipment, which I had left neatly organized on the porch table, had been rearranged. Nothing was missing, but everything had been moved. The GPS unit was now on the opposite side of the table. My notebook had been opened to a different page. Most unsettling of all, my camera had been turned on, and someone had scrolled through the photographs I had taken of the ruined house. I checked the area around the cabin for footprints but found nothing definitive. The ground was too hard and covered with fallen leaves to show clear tracks. But near the edge of the clearing, I found something that made my blood run cold, a small pile of stones arranged in a perfect spiral. The formation was too precise to be natural, too deliberate to be accidental. Someone had placed those stones there, and recently. The moss that grew on similar rocks nearby hadn't had time to establish on these. I spent the rest of the day working close to the cabin, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed. Several times I caught movement in my peripheral vision, just a flash of something pale moving between the trees, but when I turned to look directly, there was nothing there. That evening, I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of sleeping in the cabin, I moved my sleeping bag and rifle to a dense thicket about 100 yards away, where I could watch the building without being seen. It was a wise choice. Around midnight, they came. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Pale shapes seemed to drift between the trees, moving without making any sound. As they drew closer to the cabin, I could see that they were human in form but wrong in every detail that mattered. There were 6 of them, moving in single file. They wore what might once have been clothing, but the fabric hung in tatters, bleached white by decades of weather. Their skin had the same pallid, bloodless color. But it was their movements that truly unsettled me. They walked with a strange, floating gait, as if their feet barely touched the ground. They circled the cabin 3 times, always maintaining the same spacing between each figure. On the 3rd circuit, they began to hum. It was the same tune I had heard the previous 2 nights, but now I could see its source. The sound came from all 6 figures simultaneously, creating harmonies that seemed to vibrate in the bones of my skull. The melody was beautiful and terrible, hypnotic in a way that made me want to stand up and walk toward them. I forced myself to remain hidden, gripping the rifle so tightly that my knuckles ached. After perhaps 10 minutes of humming, the figures stopped at the cabin's front door. One of them, I couldn't tell if it was male or female, reached out and tried the handle. When the door didn't open, it pressed its face against the window and peered inside. From my hiding place, I could see its profile in the moonlight. The face was human but somehow elongated, as if it had been stretched like taffy. The eyes were too large, and they reflected light like an animal's. Finding the cabin empty, the figures began to spread out, searching the area systematically. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized they were looking for me. One of them passed within 10 feet of my hiding place. Up close, I could see that its feet were bare and strangely elongated, with toes that seemed to grip the ground like fingers. Its breathing was audible, a wet, rattling sound that spoke of damaged lungs or worse. The search continued for another hour before the figures finally gave up and melted back into the forest. I remained in the thicket until dawn, afraid to move, afraid to make even the slightest sound. Monday morning, I packed my truck with shaking hands. Whatever was in Blackwater Hollow, I wanted no part of it. But as I loaded the last of my equipment, I found something that stopped me cold. Attached to my truck's antenna was a small bundle of twigs bound together with what looked like human hair. The arrangement was clearly some kind of symbol or message, though I couldn't decipher its meaning. I almost left then. Every rational part of my brain screamed at me to drive away and never come back. But I had a job to finish, and despite everything I had witnessed, I wasn't entirely convinced that what I had seen was real. Shock, isolation, and too little sleep could play tricks on the mind. There had to be a logical explanation. So instead of leaving, I drove down to the old settlement to continue my survey work. The ruins looked different in daylight. What had seemed like simple decay and abandonment now appeared more sinister. Scratches on the remaining walls looked less like weather damage and more like claw marks. Dark stains on the foundation stones could have been anything, but in my current state of mind, they looked uncomfortably like dried blood. I was photographing what remained of the settlement's small church when I made a discovery that changed everything. Behind the collapsed altar, partially hidden by debris, was a trapdoor. The wood was newer than the rest of the building, maybe 20 or 30 years old rather than 50. Someone had been maintaining it. Against my better judgment, I pried it open. A wooden ladder led down into darkness. The smell that rose from below was indescribable, a mixture of decay, earth, and something sweetly organic that made my stomach clench. But there was also the faint sound of movement, and what might have been whispered voices. I climbed down. The ladder descended about 15 feet into a natural cave that had been expanded and modified by human hands. The walls were lined with stone, and niches had been carved at regular intervals. In each niche sat a small collection of personal items, photographs, jewelry, children's toys, locks of hair. But it was the far end of the cave that made me understand, finally, what I was dealing with. The wall was covered with names carved into the stone. Hundreds of them, dating back decades. But these weren't the names of the living. Each carving included birth and death dates, and at the bottom of each, in smaller letters, were the words called home. I recognized some of the names from local missing person reports I had seen over the years. Hikers who had vanished in the mountains. Hunters who had never returned. Children who had wandered away from camping trips. They hadn't left the hollow. They had been taken. As I stood reading the wall of names, I heard footsteps on the ladder behind me. I spun around to see one of the pale figures descending into the cave. In the enclosed space, the wrongness of its appearance was even more pronounced. Its limbs were too long, its joints bent at slightly incorrect angles. When it reached the cave floor, it turned to face me with those large, reflective eyes. "You shouldn't be here," it said in a voice like rustling leaves. I raised the rifle, though my hands were shaking so badly I could barely aim. "Stay back." The figure tilted its head with a movement that was distinctly bird-like. "You can't leave now. You've seen too much." "Watch me," I said, and backed toward the ladder. But more figures were descending. Within moments, I was surrounded by 6 of the pale beings. Up close, I could see that their skin wasn't just white, it was translucent, showing the dark network of veins beneath. "We were like you once," the first figure said. "Living in the world above. But the hollow called to us, just as it's calling to you." "I'm not staying here," I managed to say. "You don't understand." The figure stepped closer, and I could smell the earthiness that clung to it, like rich soil and decomposing leaves. "The hollow needs us. We tend it, we feed it, we sing to it. In return, it gives us purpose. Eternal purpose." I looked around at the carved names, at the personal belongings in the niches. "You kill people." "We don't kill," another figure said, its voice a whisper. "We transform. We show them the beauty of joining with something greater than themselves." "The hollow is alive," the first figure continued. "It's been alive for centuries, maybe millennia. It sustains us, and we sustain it. It's a perfect symbiosis." I could feel something then, a strange tugging sensation in my mind. The cave wall seemed to pulse with a subtle rhythm, like a vast heartbeat. The carved names began to blur and shift in my vision, and for a moment, I understood the appeal of what they were offering. To be part of something eternal, to never worry about loneliness or purpose again. I shook my head violently, trying to clear the compulsion. "No. I won't become like you." You already are, the figure said sadly. The moment you enter the hollow, the process began. Haven't you felt it? The way sounds carry differently here? The way time seems elastic? You've been breathing its essence for days. I realized with growing horror that it was right. I had felt different since arriving in the hollow. Colors seemed more vivid, sounds more complex. My dreams had been filled with strange imagery that I couldn't quite remember upon waking. The transformation takes time, another figure explained. Usually weeks or months. But it's inevitable once you've been marked. Marked? I whispered. The first figure pointed to my left hand. On the back of it was a small, dark mark that I hadn't noticed before. It looked like a burn, but in the shape of a perfect spiral, the same pattern I had found made from stones near the cabin. Fight it all you want, the figure said. In the end, you'll understand. You'll want to join us. The compulsion was getting stronger. The cave walls seemed to be breathing, expanding and contracting in a hypnotic rhythm. The carved names were starting to glow with a faint phosphorescent light. Part of me wanted to put down the rifle, to accept what was being offered. Instead, I fired. The bullet passed through the first figure without seeming to cause any damage. It simply stood there, looking at me with what might have been pity. Physical force won't help you, it said. We're beyond such concerns now. But the gunshot had broken the spell, at least temporarily. I pushed past the figures and scrambled up the ladder. They made no move to stop me, which somehow made it even more terrifying. They were confident that I couldn't escape. I ran through the ruins and back to my truck, the pale figures following at a leisurely pace. They knew I couldn't outrun what was happening to me. The drive back to the cabin was a nightmare. The mark on my hand was spreading, dark tendrils creeping up my wrist like living ink. My vision was changing too, I could see things in the shadows that hadn't been there before. Shapes that moved independently of the wind. Eyes that watched from the depths of the forest. At the cabin, I threw my belongings into the truck and started the engine. But as I began to drive up the hollow road, something stopped me. The humming had started again, but now I could understand it. It wasn't just music, it was a language, complex and beautiful beyond anything human voices could create. It was telling the story of the hollow, of the entity that lived within it, of the symbiotic relationship it had developed with those who chose to stay. I found myself slowing the truck, then stopping entirely. The song was so beautiful, so compelling. It promised peace, purpose, an end to the loneliness that had plagued me since my divorce. The mark on my hand was now halfway to my elbow. As it spread, I could feel my connection to the hollow growing stronger. I began to understand why the pale figures moved as they did, why their joints bent at strange angles. They were adapting to something that existed partially outside normal physical space. I sat in the truck for what felt like hours, listening to the song, feeling the transformation continue. Part of me was horrified, but a larger part was curious. What would it be like to be part of something so ancient and vast? To have a purpose that transcended individual human concerns? It was only when I saw my reflection in the rearview mirror that I snapped back to full awareness of what was happening. My eyes had grown larger, more reflective. My skin had taken on a pale, translucent quality. With tremendous effort, I put the truck in gear and drove away from the hollow. The journey back to civilization was agony. Every mile I traveled away from the hollow felt like being stretched on a rack. The mark on my arm began to burn like acid, and my vision flickered between normal sight and something else, something that showed the world as a network of interconnected energy patterns. I made it as far as Beckley before I had to stop. The pain was unbearable, and I was starting to lose control of my motor functions. I checked into a motel and called in sick to work, claiming I had come down with flu. For 3 days, I lay in that motel room, fighting the most intense battle of my life. The mark continued to spread, and with it came visions of the hollow. I could see the pale figures going about their daily routines, tending to gardens that grew in impossible soil, maintaining structures that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, singing their complex songs to an entity that pulsed beneath the earth like a vast heart. On the 4th day, the mark began to recede. I don't know why. Maybe my distance from the hollow weakened its influence. Maybe my resistance was stronger than usual. Or maybe the entity simply decided I wasn't worth the effort. But slowly, painfully, The dark tendrils withdrew down my arm and the mark faded to a barely visible scar. My vision returned to normal. The compulsion to return to the hollow diminished to a manageable level. I was free. I filed my report with the Forestry Department, recommending against any development in Blackwater Hollow due to unstable geological conditions. Dale accepted the report without question. Government agencies were always looking for reasons to avoid expensive projects. That was 25 years ago. I never went back to the hollow, and I never spoke publicly about what I experienced there. Who would believe such a story? But sometimes, late at night when the wind is right, I can still hear that haunting melody. It's fainter now, muffled by distance and time, but it's there. The mark on my hand never completely disappeared. In certain lights, you can still see the faint outline of a spiral. And sometimes, when I'm very tired or stressed, it starts to darken again. When that happens, I know it's time to move further away from the mountains. I've spent years researching similar phenomena across Appalachia. The stories are there if you know where to look, accounts of entire communities that simply vanished, leaving no trace except for empty houses and unexplained stone formations. Government records that have been classified or mysteriously lost. Geological surveys that recommend against development for reasons that don't quite make sense. The hollow is still there, still waiting. And it's not the only one. There are places in these ancient mountains where the boundaries between our world and something else have worn thin. Places where entities that predate human civilization still hold sway. Most people sense this instinctively and stay away. But there are always a few who are drawn to the mystery, who ignore the warnings and venture into places they shouldn't go. Some of them come back changed. Others don't come back at all. Last month, I saw a news report about a surveyor who had gone missing in the mountains of eastern Kentucky. The search teams found his truck abandoned on an old logging road, but no trace of the man himself. The story mentioned that local residents had reported hearing strange singing in the woods at night. I know I should have stayed silent. I should have minded my own business and let the authorities handle it. But I couldn't shake the image of another name being carved into a stone wall, another collection of personal belongings being placed in a niche in an underground cave. So I'm telling this story now, putting it down on paper in the hope that someone will read it and understand the warning. There are places in this world that should be left alone, entities that should not be disturbed, and songs that should never be heard. If you're ever in the mountains and you hear humming in the night, beautiful, complex harmonies that seem to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, don't investigate. Don't try to find the source. Don't listen too closely to the melody. Just leave. As fast as you can, and don't look back. The hollow is patient. It has waited for centuries, and it can wait for centuries more. But if you give it the chance, it will call you home. And in that place, home is forever.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like and subscribe button, and then share it with your friends. Your support helps us grow and create even more awesome content. We appreciate you being part of the journey.